Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday. We are excited today to be able to talk with you about religious trauma and the impact of adverse religious experiences. My name is David Mcclung. I'm a proud member of the INTAC team and work with the University of Texas at Austin with the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health. And so before we begin today, I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to give a small overview of INTAC. And so again, just to note, so this presentation was prepared for INTAC under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation, except that taken directly from copyrighted sources, is in public domain and may be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. Citation of the source is, however, appreciated. We ask that you do not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without specific written authorization from INTAC, and know that this presentation will be recorded and posted on our website. This event is supported by SAMHSA of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, otherwise known as HHS, as part of Financial Assistance Award SM-20-008 over the course of 5 years, ranging from 2020 to 2025, with 100% funded from SAMHSA and HHS. At the time of this presentation, Marian Delpham-Rittman served as Assistant Secretary for Mental Health and Substance Use and Administrator of SAMHSA. And the contents, again, are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor are an endorsement by SAMHSA, HHS, or the US government. And so as we begin, just to give you a quick overview of INTAC, you'll notice that INTAC is a multidisciplinary team that consists of a wide array of different partners, including University of Texas at Austin, Change Matrix, Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development, CARS, or the Center for Applied Research Solutions, MedStar Georgetown University Hospital, the American Academy of Pediatrics, FREDLA, which stands for the Family Run Executive Director Leadership Association, and Youth Move National. And so with that then, our goal as INTAC is that all children, youth, young adults, and families with emotional or behavioral health needs can access evidence-based treatment and recovery services in a well-coordinated system of care. Some of the kinds of partners who we traditionally have partnered with include state and local agency leaders, members of the mental health workforce, primary care providers, the school workforce, community-based providers, peer supervisors, and certainly family partners and youth partners as well, emphasizing those family-driven and youth-driven principles that we value so importantly and are such an important part of that. And so one of the ways that we do that is we provide no-cost training, technical assistance, and resources. You'll notice that to your right, there's a wide array of different ways that we do that, including individual consultation, peer learning exchanges, customized coaching, training academies, communities of practice, our 5 Things digests, podcasts, practical tools, and more. And so as we begin today, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we've got 3 amazing presenters today that I'm extremely excited to be able to hear from. Those include Tobias, Adamina, and Brian. And I'm going to allow for them to introduce themselves. And then we'll start with Adamina today. And so, Brian, if you don't mind introducing yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, my name's Adamina Tankersley. I want to apologize ahead of time. I'm having some bandwidth issues, so I'm going to be off camera. I am a parent caregiver of a young adult son with diagnosed and living with autism and other mental health challenges. And I'm also a member of the INTAC team. Good to meet everybody this morning.
Thank you so much, Adamina. And then Tobias or Brian.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tobias. I stay in Georgia, Albany, Georgia, and I'm an 11th grader at the Best Doherty Comprehensive High School. And yeah, and I'm happy to be on here today.
Thank you so much, Tobias. And last but certainly not least, Brian.
Yeah, my name is Brian Peck. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I work with folks who have experienced religious trauma or have been harmed in a religious context in my clinical practice here in Boise, Idaho, which is the ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, and Bannock peoples. And I'm just so grateful to be part of this conversation and hopefully to expand this conversation to better understand religious trauma.
Thank you so much, Brian. And so just to kind of put this in context briefly, again, this is part of a webinar series designed around increasing conversation and partnerships between faith communities and mental health professionals and the mental health workforce. We recognize that these conversations are sometimes limited in their scope and that there's not always a lot of opportunity for us to be able to have those kinds of conversations. And so at this point, we've talked about mental health literacy with faith communities. We've talked a few weeks ago about the intersection between mental health and faith and spirituality. One of the things that's really important in this is also a conversation that recognizes that even though religion and spirituality may bring a sense of meaning or purpose and social support for individuals, at the same time, there's also potential for beliefs and practices to sometimes be harmful. And so today we're excited to be able to talk about this concept of religious trauma. We often talk about trauma-informed care, adverse childhood experiences, and what that looks like in practice. But I don't think it's very often that we have this opportunity to talk about religious trauma and the impact that that has on children, youth, and their families as well. And so I'm extremely excited to be able to have these amazing three individuals and for you to be able to join us in this conversation as well. As we do so, we're going to begin by hearing from Adamina this morning. And so I will turn it over to her. Afterwards, we'll then hear from Brian. And then finally, we'll hear from Tobias before an opportunity for some ongoing kind of conversation, Q&A, et cetera.
Thank you. So a little bit more background about myself. I reside in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, big city. I didn't really grow up in the church. My siblings and I actually introduced, the Baptist church life to our family. My father owned a newsstand, back in the day of newsstands being on the corner. And the five of us used to run the newsstand on Sundays. So we were all on the corner and we saw a group of people going by and they were talking about the church. And we started going to the church, the five of us, after we would close down the newsstand. So that's how we actually got introduced into, attending church, going to church on a regular basis. Once we started attending, my mom, who grew up in a Catholic church, and my father, who, at the time I did not know, he was raised by a minister, a Baptist minister. But at the time when I was younger, my dad was practicing being a Muslim. So from us going to the Baptist church, both our parents joined that church, and all seven of us were baptized during the same time frame. So that was like a really huge experience for us to connect as a family. And we, as the five children, were really excited because we're like, wow, we did this and we brought God into our home and this is awesome. And, our parents followed us, a little child would lead them, because they say that a lot, in the Baptist church. I don't know if that's said in other churches, but in Baptist churches, they say a lot, a little child would lead them. So once I became an adult, I had my son. Now I had my son out of wedlock. So the church that I was attending really didn't like that whole, you had a kid out of wedlock with someone that was in the church. So I decided to leave that church, because I did have a son and, he's out of wedlock and all that, even though it was kind of preached, we don't do these things. But as kids, you learn different little things of who's being with who and who does what. But we just aren't supposed to talk about it, but you see what's going on as a kid growing up in church. So my issue with attending certain churches came when my son got his autism diagnosis. And that was when he was a lot older. My son was not diagnosed with autism, under the age of 5. That's typically when kids are diagnosed, like under the age of like 3 to 5 years old. My son got his autism diagnosis at 13. So that changed a lot of things, when he was 13 and, how we interacted with things, how I had to conversate with him to make sure that he was understanding things and to still put him out there. But once he turned about 15, he started having other mental health concerns. He was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder. So when that was introduced, that I had to learn about that diagnosis, as well as having to learn about the autism diagnosis. And during all this time, his paternal grandmother, his dad's grandmother, became a pastor. So I don't think she meant to give judgment on what was going on with Elijah, but she would say a lot of things like, you need to grow up. You're the oldest grandchild. You have to show an example. And I think at the time I was taking it personal, like, you're his grandmom. You shouldn't say that to him. So I think that's where the line with, you know, how I felt about how the church was viewing him kind of started to agitate me. And I didn't see it as a place of comfort. But I saw her as, oh, this is his grandmother saying this. So I went to one of those very large churches with, like, you know, thousands of members. But that was just a lot for my son because, you know, when you have autism, the large crowds can often be triggering. So I had to look for a smaller church for him. So we did find a smaller church. We attended a smaller church, but that church was a little too small because there was no supports for someone with autism to be able to understand the sermon that was being given, for him to be able to understand that, you know, God loves you and break it down in that way. My son was interpreting the sermons as, you're doing wrong. This is, you know, you should be mature. You know, the mistakes you made are condemning you and you're going to go to hell. So my son was always thinking after he heard a sermon that I'm on my way to hell because I hear voices, I have demons inside of me. And that gave me, that scared me because I didn't want my son walking around thinking that he's possessed or has demons. So I said, okay, we have to find a church that is going to more embrace him in his mental health challenges and where he is. Because my son, when he goes to church, he brings toys with him. He sits on the pew with his music because sometimes the music, the choir singing is too loud for him. So I needed to find an environment that would be a little bit more cohesive for him and that he could be free to, if he needs to walk around and pace in the back of the church, he would be able to do that. By this time, his grandmother had her own church building. So I said, okay, let's try going to his grandmother's church. So I started bringing him there, and that was the support that I thought we were looking for. So he was able to pace back and forth in the back of the church if he needed to. You know, he was able to have his action figures out if he wanted to have them out and listen to his music if he wanted to, until we got to a day where he felt uneasy and he felt unsafe. So my son, when he feels uneasy or safe, he is not one that will go to his coping skills so that he could calm down. My son often gets so engrossed in the moment of his fear or anxiety that he needs a PRN. A PRN is like a sedative that you get in the moment, you know, in addition to, you know, other meds that he takes. And I did speak with my son about what I'm allowed to talk about. So I'm allowed to talk about this section of his life. He did grant me that permission. So one day I was in the restroom, and when I came out, the security for the church was like, you need to get your son. He's acting all crazy in the back. I was immediately offended by that. So I go to where my son is, and you could tell that he was afraid. And people around him was like, there's nothing wrong with you. Like, why are you acting like that? Like, you're showing off to get attention. So I kind of ushered my son into a private room, and I talked to him and I gave him his medication. And, you know, we just stayed in there and he drank water until he calms down. But like 2 days later, he ended up going in crisis. So he had to go into the hospital. This time his grandmother visited him in the hospital, and her viewing him in the hospital, she came to me later and said, I really thought that, you know, he could just mature out of what he was doing. I really thought that, you know, you were just mothering him a little too much. She said, but seeing him in the hospital really let me see where he's vulnerable at, and I'm looking at him differently. And I didn't know that she had that opinion so strongly of like, you can just stop doing what you're doing. That was the first time I had ever been confronted with someone saying or thinking you're in control of your mental health. If you just didn't do things that way, you would be all right. I mean, we did have times of like, oh, just pray about it. He'll get better. You have to have stronger faith. If you had stronger faith and you taught him the Bible and you prayed with him, things would be better. I had been told that several times by many people, but I was never confronted with that by his grandmother. And I thought of all people, his grandmother would have a better understanding, because every time he's in the hospital, she knew about it. She knew about the medication he was on. She knew about different things that, went on with my son, different traumas that he's had in the past. So I really was more hurt than anything that his grandmother, also the pastor of the church we're attending, would say that. But that also made me feel like, okay, well, now she understands. Okay, now we're on the other side of things. We've gotten past that bridge of things. So we're still attending the church, and when he was in the hospital, because he would have long stays in the hospital, the other parishioners were like, oh, how's Elijah? How's he doing? And at first, I would be honest and tell people what was going on. And then I started having people tell me, well, if you just give him more freedom and let him get a job, he'll grow up. And in my head, I'm like, a job is not going to help where he's at and needs to grow in areas. So then I'm thinking, like, why are people saying that to me? Then I had people telling me, oh, well, I just think that you should pray more because we count it all joy, and everything God places before you is to help to strengthen you, and everything we should be excited about. And in my head, I'm like, I'm not excited that he's in the hospital. I'm not happy that he's in the hospital. Like, I'm concerned, I don't want him to be there. So then I had to take myself to a place of, I can't pay attention to what people are saying. I just have to make sure that I'm praying about what I need to pray about. If I feel like I need to cry, that's what I'm going to do. But I stopped sharing what was going on with Elijah. And if I brought him to church, I brought him to church. And if he was in the hospital, I would just tell people, oh, he's just not here today. He's staying with my mom. So now I'm lying about what's going on with my kid to other parishioners. And just a few months ago, my son, he would go to his grandmother and say, could you pray with me so I could feel better? And I never had a problem with that. But then we got to a point where when she would pray with him, he would become more agitated. So then I asked her, I said, even if he comes to you to ask you to pray with him, don't pray with him. I said, you can pray for him, but don't pray with him because that's triggering him. And then I'm having to give him more medication and deal with it later. I said, so let's pray for him, but let's not pray with him. I said, I don't know how we're going to have this conversation with him, but that's triggering him. So she got a little upset with me because she was like, well, I should be able to lay hands on him if I want to. And, so that was a lot going on. I think that was more like the grandmother coming out instead of the pastor coming out. But pastors are humans and they play roles in their families' lives. So then we had to get to a point where I don't take my son to church anymore. And it's been about, I say 6 months. No, it's about 8 months. I don't bring my son to church anymore. The church, he has expressed that he feels like when he's at church, he's being judged. People are looking at him funny and he's acting weird. So I don't bring him to church anymore. I go online and I bring up, like Joel Osteen and things of that nature for him to listen to an uplifting message from God. I have my own personal Bible study with him. Now, I still do attend the church, but I just don't bring my son. I let my son stay home and we do things online so that he can experience spirituality and he can have his connection with God on the terms that are good for him, and he not feel judged and he not feel like I'm a weirdo because I hear voices, or people are saying I'm possessed because I hear voices, because that's hurtful. And it was really hurtful for me as his mom that people say he's possessed, for him to think that he is possessed or has a demon within him, because he's such a sweet kid. Well, young man, he's so sweet and he's so genuine, and he's really being vulnerable when he's playing with his toys at the church because he plays with them for comfort. And for people to look at him and to judge him when he's just trying to be himself is very, very hurtful. And I feel hurt that he can't attend church anymore. So that's just our backstory. And I just wanted to share my story so that other people can understand that it matters what you say to other people when you're in church, regardless of what you're thinking. Sometimes certain things shouldn't be said, whether you're thinking them or not. I mean, it would be great if people didn't think them, but don't always share what you're thinking, because sometimes you think you're encouraging someone with what you're saying, but a lot of times it's not. you're passing a judgment off and trying to hide it behind God. And I really think that that's offensive. But that's my time. And thank you for listening. I appreciate the podium. So I'm going to hand it
Thank
back
you
off to
so much,
David.
Adamina. I so appreciate your wisdom and your willingness to share this. And just, I think these are the kinds of stories that I think are happening a lot. And there's just not an awareness that they're happening sometimes because there is so much stigma around talking about these types of experiences. And so I so appreciate your willingness to share. We're going to turn it over to Brian now. And Brian will share some of the work that he's been doing around this topic.
Perfect. It's so great to meet everyone here. I'm trying to get my screen set up and now it's asking for permission, so I'm so sorry. I'll get this ready here in just 1 second. Oh, I thought I have everything ready and now it's not working. Let me just real quick. Unless David, do you have the slides? I don't know that I can. If you can
I'd be happy
toggle
to share
through those
those.
for me.
Absolutely. Give me 1 quick second and I am more than happy to do that. There you go.
Okay, perfect, great. So my name is Brian Peck. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and one of the founders of the Religious Trauma Institute. And yeah, and I'm just so excited to be here today. I'm joining you from Boise, Idaho, which is the ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, and Bannock peoples. And my partner and my 2 kids, we enjoy spending time outdoors and just really love being in this area. I want to invite you to prioritize your well-being during this presentation. I won't be sharing intentionally triggering content, but we are talking about religious abuse, and that may be challenging to some folks. So do bear that in mind. If you need to pause or step away, feel free to do what's necessary for you to be safe and okay. What is trauma? I know this is a presentation about religious trauma, and it might be helpful for us to begin by kind of having a concept of trauma. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration's concept of trauma, I think, is a really great one. It's broad enough and yet specific enough to really capture the experience of trauma. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning in mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. I know that's a mouthful. I think the things I want to point out from this definition are, it's not the event itself, but it's how that event is experienced. And we'll talk a bit more about that here in a moment. Viewing trauma through the lens of nervous system dysregulation. When we're healthy and safe, we're able to navigate the world fairly easily. But when we experience something that's overwhelming to us, it can be dysregulating. And so trauma does not exist in the event. Trauma exists in our physiological response to the events. I think it's a helpful way of kind of addressing that. More precisely, trauma exists within the unresolved survival response to events that overwhelmed our nervous system. When we experience an event that is too much, too fast for us, and it's overwhelming, that's where trauma lives. In situations where we needed to do something to defend or protect ourselves, but we're unable to do that, didn't have the resources to do that or the safety and the support to do that, that kind of unresolved survival response lives in our nervous system, in our body, until we have an opportunity to resolve that at some later point. And it's often the cumulative effect of experiences and circumstances that result in trauma. We often think of trauma in the kind of big shock trauma kind of experiences, and those are more obvious to us. But when it comes to developmental trauma, complex trauma, religious trauma, often it's this ongoing impact that's happening over a period of time that's placing a demand on our nervous system. Trauma results from a mismatch between our internal and external resources and the demands placed on our nervous system. And so I think that can be a helpful way of thinking about trauma as well. It's not that the event is so significant that it's causing trauma, although that's a factor. if we have a lot of internal and external resources and support around us, that may not result in trauma. That may just be an adverse experience that we can navigate through. So if we apply these principles to religious trauma, what might that look like? The Religious Trauma Institute, along with some other colleagues, we developed this working definition that will sound very familiar. It matches the definition that I shared earlier. Religious trauma is the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is experienced by an individual as overwhelming or disruptive and has lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And again, that's a mouthful. We're wanting to focus on, it's not religion itself, but it's how that person's nervous system is experiencing those religious beliefs, practices, and structures. In the same way that trauma doesn't exist in the event itself, religious trauma doesn't exist in religion itself. So this isn't a presentation about religion is universally harmful. It's about how some practices can be harmful to us. So some adverse religious beliefs, practices, and structures are more likely to result in religious trauma. And I think it's helpful for us to be able to identify those. We also, in addition to this working definition of religious trauma, we've introduced adverse religious experiences as a concept that kind of mirrors adverse childhood experiences, which is helping us focus not so much on, religion being harmful in and of itself, but what are the kinds of experiences that tend to result in, or that tend to be adversive for folks. So our definition of adverse religious experiences is any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy and or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, psychological, or spiritual well-being. So I'll give some examples of what are common adverse religious experiences. And this is based on the work of Catherine Keller, her spiritual abuse questionnaire. And in her research, she found she was focusing more on spiritual abuse, which religious trauma expands beyond spiritual abuse. But I think what she identifies is really, really helpful. So these four characteristics are abusive power, conditionality, suppression of expression, and spiritual injury. We look at abusive power, we're talking about, organizations or individuals using a control, or they're controlling others by use of fear and often shame. There's often not freedom to ask questions or express doubts. There can be harsh criticism that tends to be common in more high demand religious groups. And there's this lack of consent that tends to be a part of that mix as well. Conditionality. There's this performance-based acceptance. So you can be part of the group if you do what you're told, if you follow our rules and conform to what the group expects. Punishment tends to be also part of that as well, and that can be the fear of punishment by God or a deity or others in the group. And then absolute perfection is demanded. And it may not be absolute perfection, but there tends to be a high demand on living or being or acting a certain way. And then often there's transactional relationships in those contexts as well. It's what you're expected to do and what you get in exchange for that. Suppression of expression. Often within these types of religious contexts, certain feelings are unacceptable. We're supposed to be joyful or happy, or if we're anxious, that's a sign of not being spiritually healthy or well, as opposed to recognizing those as common human experiences. In these contexts, we're often taught to distrust our body or intuition. The beliefs are more are prioritized over your actual physical human experience. Purity culture tends to be a really big one as well, and we could spend a whole other day talking about purity culture and the impacts that it has on folks. And then gender inequality, that also tends to be a factor in spiritual abuse. And then spiritual injury, frequent trauma triggers. Listen to Adamina speaking about her experience earlier. Often you're in contexts where folks are behaving or doing things that aren't helpful or healthy for you as an individual or your child, and those aren't addressed, and they don't adapt to the needs of the group often. Severe distrust in yourself and others. There's the in-group versus out-group dynamic that's often common as well. You can't trust those folks because they don't have the truth. And then also distrusting yourself. Your mind may be deceitful. You need to just trust the beliefs as opposed to what's right for you as an individual. And spiritual and emotional betrayal. That's a common experience that's very aversive for folks. And then complicated spiritual grief and loss. When we begin to question our beliefs or develop new understandings of God or our own spiritual practices, there can be a sense of loss or disconnection that comes from that as well. Other examples of adverse religious experiences, faith deconstruction, folks who are asking questions about their faith, or again, developing a new understanding, a concept of God or spirituality that fits better for them or their family. That process inside of a high demand religious group can be dismissed or looked down upon, and that can be potentially harmful for folks. Shunning and excommunication. This is common in a lot of high demand groups as well, where if you don't do as you're told, you'll be cut off from the group. And as we know, as humans evolved within groups, to lose access to that resource can be really devastating for folks. Conversion therapy, other ways of trying to control or manipulate a person's sexual identity can be really harmful. Spiritual bypassing. I think Adamina also mentioned in her talk that if you just trust God enough, things will be better. And there is that kind of not addressing the actual needs of the individual, but kind of spiritualizing or kind of normalizing experiences that aren't healthy and safe for us. Stephen Hassan, he does a lot of work with cults or high demand groups, and his BITE model can be a helpful model for us to consider as well, where in a group where your behaviors are controlled, the information is controlled, there's a thought control component as well, and then emotions are also controlled. All of those can be potentially adverse religious experiences for folks. Brene Brown, in her wisdom, shared this quote: "When the culture of an organization mandates that it is more important to protect the reputation of a system and those in power than it is to protect the basic human dignity of individuals or communities, you can be certain that shame is systemic, money drives ethics, and accountability is dead." And those are some factors that we can consider when it comes to assessing a group or a context to see, what's actually going on here. How is shame being leveraged to control others? What's more important, the needs of the individuals in the community or the needs of the group itself? So the Religious Trauma Institute, we have an exploratory survey where we've asked folks to share a bit about their adverse religious experiences as a way of beginning to develop some categories or types of experiences that tend to be more adverse for folks. And so here are some findings from that survey so far. The top 5 things folks felt in response to adverse religious experiences. The number one, by a fair margin, was shame. Second was powerless, fear, unworthy, and isolated. And as we look at those 5 things there, and we think about how trauma works, there's trauma and shame are often connected. Trauma often feels powerless. I need to do something to defend or protect myself, but I'm unable to do that. And so I think that while an adverse religious experience may or may not result in religious trauma, it certainly is a context where trauma is more likely to occur. Folks reported blaming themselves. Again, that kind of blaming ourselves, internalizing that shame, serves an adaptive survival function for us. When our caregivers, our supportive community is doing something that harms us, and if we were to acknowledge that this is not safe and okay for us, it could be really disruptive for us. It could change everything we know about the world. And so it's easier for us to blame ourselves as a way of trying to maintain some control in a context where we have very little control. And so we would expect that when everything you know about the world is through the lens of a particular group or belief system, when it doesn't work for you personally, it would be common to blame ourselves. They also reported depression, social anxiety, difficulty making decisions, interpersonal conflict, and what we know about trauma and how that presents. These experiences would be quite common. These adverse religious experiences also impacted folks' mental health. They reported that was the #1 impact that they had: social relationships, personal identity, sexuality, and intimate relationships. Those are other impacts to folks. The majority of folks said that the adverse religious experiences had a significant impact on them at the time. We gave them options to choose how significant that impact was, and the majority of folks said that at the time it was very significant for them. And they continue, so after there's been some time passed since that event, they continue to distrust others and experience anger, sadness, shame, and rejection. Again, we would expect that to be the case if something that's happened to you has been traumatizing. So let's just shift gears here a little bit and focus on, as it comes to children and families, what can we do to religious trauma-proof our kids? And Cindy Wang Brandt developed these kind of 5 things here that I found to be very helpful. And I've added a kind of a bonus one at the end, so just kind of look forward to that. So community, compassion, consent. Thanks so much, David. Co-regulation and communication. So let's just kind of look at these individually. Consent, I think this is one of the big ones. If we can honor our kids' consent, if we can trust that they know what's right for them, we can offer them choices, if we can teach and respect boundaries, model that for others, that can be really, really empowering and can prevent them from situations where others are exercising control over them. Communication, encouraging our kids to communicate their needs, for us to be a safe and supportive listener, a non-judgmental person, and to teach them the language of sensation. I just want to touch on this a bit more. So often in many religious contexts, there's a really strong focus on the beliefs, and much of that's happening in our minds. It's where, are we believing the right things? Are we not believing the things we shouldn't? And do I have the correct concept of what it means to be human? And often that's a bit disconnected from our body. That's a bit disconnected from our nervous system. And so we can begin to speak in the language of sensation, giving words for how we're physically feeling. That gives us a lot more insight into whether we're safe or not, what we need to do in response to situations that aren't okay for us. So that can be a really helpful way of communicating. And then community, encouraging a diversity of experiences, meeting other folks, connecting beyond us versus them groups. There tends to be an in-group versus out-group dynamic. Just by virtue of being humans, we tend to organize ourselves in us versus them. And so we can begin to build bridges across those divides. That can be an amazing resource and can protect us against experiences that can be more controlling. And then model healthy relationships. Of course, that's a big factor as well. And then compassion. We talked about shame being one of the most common responses to an adverse religious experience. And if we can begin to undermine shame with compassion, if we can model self-compassion, what it's like to have compassion for ourselves, teaching our kids to offer themselves compassion, and then making your home, your church, your office a shame-free space, that can be an incredible resource for kids as well. In co-regulation, this is probably as a therapist, as a trauma therapist, this is probably one of my favorite ones. I think maybe one of the most significant ones, along with consent. Our nervous systems are a powerful resource for our kids. When we are safe and okay, when we're able to be there for our kids, that can really be an amazing resource for them. So we can model that regulation ourselves, and we can, teach and model coping skills that can be really powerful. And then making repairs when ruptures happen in those relationships. As a parent myself, I know that I'm not perfect in my parenting, and a lot of my own journey in parenting has been breaking cycles, and, being there for my kids in ways that my parents weren't there for me. And none of us will do that perfectly. I think when it comes to, ruptures in a relationship, it's not the rupture that's the most impactful thing. It's what we do next. Are we able to admit that we were wrong? Are we able to, make repairs? That's a really amazing thing to model for our children. And that can be a really protective factor as well. And I promised you a bonus C. This is one that I'm really fond of as well. Oftentimes, trauma is very kind of narrowing and isolating and disconnecting. And when we begin to model curiosity and openness, connecting with our environment and with others, that can, be an amazing resource for our kids' nervous systems as well. Being curious about about their experience, about our experience, being curious about other people's experience. We can model some empathy and connection that way as well. And then I want to just say a little bit more about exploratory orienting. And here I'll just throw in a little kind of skill that can be really powerful for us, for all of us, and for our kids. As mammals, when we feel safe in the world, we're just kind of looking around, noticing. There's this kind of scanning our environment for cues of safety or threat. And as long as we're feeling more or less safe and okay, we're just open and connected. And as soon as we are in the presence of a threat, we'll kind of have often a startle response at first, and then we may go into a fight or flight response. And if it's too overwhelming for us, we may go into a freeze collapse or a please appease response. When we're able to just notice and look around our space where we're at, notice the trees outside, notice a piece of art on the wall that's particularly meaningful to you, there's just a kind of an opening up to that skill in and of itself can be just a really amazing resource. So exploratory orienting can be really helpful as well. We talked a little bit about, the language of sensation. These are a few examples of words that can be helpful. And this is from Trauma Proofing Your Kids by Peter Levine and Maggie Klein. And so as we're teaching this new language, we can begin to use words like, what are you noticing in your body, and where are you noticing that? Is it cold or warm, or, is it soft or stuck? Or if your experience had a color, what color would it be? If it had a shape, what shape would it be? If it had a texture, what texture would it be? And kids pretty much at any age, and even adults, many of us connect with those more tactile or visual ways of expressing ourselves. And so building in that language of sensation can be a really amazing resource as well. So let's talk a little bit about supporting survivors as they resolve religious trauma. First of all, it's important to remember there are many ways to resolve religious trauma. What works for one person may or may not work for another. It's really good to keep that in mind. This quote by Lisa Feldman Barrett is really, really helpful and right on the nose. The best thing for your nervous system is another human, that our ability to co-regulate. And the worst thing for your nervous system is another human. It's really helpful to remember that. It's how we're showing up. It's how our nervous system is in that moment with our children that can make a huge difference. Believe survivors. Some of the most powerful words you can say to a survivor is, I see you, I hear you, I believe you. Then prioritizing safety. Often when it comes to supporting survivors, we want things to be better. We want them to get over it or get past it or get through it. And it's important for us to really focus on what do they need to feel safe now in this moment. As Stephen Porges reminds us, the removal of threat is not the same thing as the experience of safety. It's one thing to leave an abusive or harmful environment, but our nervous system won't trust that quite yet. We need to experience safety, and we want to be more intentional about creating conditions for safety. And this one, when it comes to religious trauma, can be really helpful to not force forgiveness. Oftentimes forgiveness is kind of weaponized against folks. It's a way to get survivors to just move on and excuse or dismiss what happened to them. And in fact, forgiveness is not required to resolve trauma. And as I just described, in some cases, it can actually prevent us from healing. Religious trauma is not just in your head. We talked a bit earlier about how in a lot of religious contexts, the beliefs are the primary focus. And it can feel like if I just think the right thoughts, have the right beliefs, I'm going to be okay. And as we were talking about trauma existing in the nervous system, that explains why we can't think, pray, or believe ourselves out of trauma. Yeah, it's important to remember that as well. Valuing their humanity over your beliefs. Beliefs that may be a resource for you can be harmful to others, especially when they're held so tightly that you can't see or recognize their humanity. Be careful about giving advice. I know a lot of us kind of instinctively want to do that. Here's how things could be better. Here's what I think you should do. Here's what I think is right for you. In most cases, trauma survivors don't want advice. They want to experience safety and connection. And that, again, is where your nervous system can be a resource for them. And this one's a little controversial and can be challenging, especially the way anger and aggression has been stigmatized in our society, in our culture, and especially in some religious context. We're not talking about a destructive, harmful form of anger or aggression, but we're talking about, as Peter Levine talks about, the restoration of healthy aggression is an essential part in the recovery from trauma. If we can't leave this context that's harmful for us, if we can't push back, if we can't say no, if we can't set a boundary, it's almost impossible for us to feel safe. And so we want to honor and validate aggression when it's in the service of safety and connection. This is a good reminder as well. If you've ever seen the original quote, it kind of comes across as a bit dismissive of a person's experience. Trauma is not your fault, but that kind of that cancels out what was just said. But healing is your responsibility. I think it maybe is more helpful to just place a period after trauma is not your fault, period. A survivor is not solely responsible for their healing. And in fact, as we understand trauma, oftentimes the nervous system is not able to respond. When you're in a freeze collapse response, we can say, well, you should have left, or you should have done something to defend or protect yourself. But they physiologically were unable to do that because they didn't have the safety and the resources they needed. And also, I think it's important for us to remember that healing is a collective responsibility. It's up to us to provide a context where healing is possible as well. Just to give some more insight from survivors themselves, I asked survivors what they wished therapists, and I think we can include parents and clergy and other helping professionals here as well. What survivors wish therapists understood about religious trauma. Here's a few quotes from them. Jennifer says, religious trauma isn't an add-on condition. If faith is the core of your existence, all else radiates from faith, not to it. Treatment needs to come from that understanding. Tiana says that the experience of religious trauma can be incredibly, even unbearably difficult to describe, even to a trusted therapist, because it's so deeply contextual. It can be helpful for us to understand what was your particular religious experience that was harmful to you. And that's going to vary from church to church, from group to group. Understand to be sensitive to the fact that minority and intersectional folks, especially as queer ones, had a slightly different and possibly more deeply damaging experience. Relatively benign churches like the one I grew up in can be a real whore for a scared, closeted gay kid. And this quote by Carmen Kuhl is something that I come back to in the work that I do in therapy. And I think it's a good reminder for all of us. The goal of therapy should never be to help people adjust to oppression. If our focus is on, trying to help an individual just deal with abuse or be okay in a situation or a context that's not safe and healthy and supportive for them, that's not a really healthy focus for us. We want to address the oppression and the harm, and to empower survivors to do what's necessary for them to feel safe and okay again. I believe that together we can prevent adverse religious experiences, and we can help individuals resolve religious trauma. It's not easy work. It requires us to be more aware of contexts that can be harmful, and also to learn more about our bodies and our nervous systems and what we need to feel safe and okay again. But I'm hopeful that we can do this work together. Thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed our time together. My contact information is here, and I look forward to hearing from Tobias and also having a bit of a panel conversation as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brian. I so appreciate your willingness to share your expertise, really be able to help us think through what this looks like within systems of care for us, but also for mental health professionals and for clergy and for youth themselves. And so I so appreciate your willingness to share that experience and to share your wisdom with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, David.
So we'll have a chance to hear more from Brian in a few minutes. But before we do, I'm going to turn it over to Tobias.
Hello, everyone. Again, just to let you know, my name is Tobias. But with religious trauma, my family is extremely religious. Grew up in the church. Every Sunday, the church band would come by, pick us up. We would always be at church. It was every Sunday, you had Bible study, every Wednesday night, prayer every Monday, and we had to be there for every day. I've always knew that I had a different feeling than the other boys I hung around. I've always raised up around my cousins. Male cousins, female cousins, my brothers, but I always knew there was a different feeling. When the girls came around, they were turned on, they was happy. I was never that. I was just always looking for a friendship with them. But because my family was extremely religious, in a way, I had to cover or tone that part of me down to appeal a certain way to them. In many cases, my mother would say crazy things of, oh, get you a girlfriend, because in religion, Christianity, if anyone in here practices Christianity, the sin, one of the sins are do not have relationships with the same sex. So, and my mother did practice that. Around last year of time, my mother finally asked me, she said, Tobias, are you gay? And I said, yes, ma'am. And, as a parent, she knew, but again, because she was in the church, because we were in the church, it was something that she always overlooked because, didn't want to come into terms with it. I told her, and she said, well, you can't. At the time, I was a junior deacon in the church. So that should let you know how much I was really trying to make others happy. Let's put it that way. Because I was a junior deacon in the church. I stayed in the church 24/7. And I'm not going to lie to you. Also, I used the phrases of trying to make it seem like I was heterosexual. Oh, you're gay. That is not of God. The whole time I'm just trying to be something that I'm really not. So mom was like, you can't be a junior deacon with being gay. You can't be a part of this with being gay. It was always a can't do this with being gay. There was times when I haven't heard any disrespectful things. I would say that because they weren't disrespectful. It was just her. And I'm not angry because I understand where she's not been guided correctly, if that makes sense. And religion is crazy, but the church was always judgmental. Always judgmental. Not everyone in the church, not everyone now, but the church was always judgmental. And if you don't have a personal relationship with God, or you don't have a personal connection with someone spiritually or whatever religion you practice, and you follow, if I had not had my relationship with God myself, because in the Bible it said God loves all his children. So I believe God still loves me, even though sin it, when everyone in the Bible, it says everyone is going to sin. So the church would always, of course, the pastor would make the sermons. You come in here, don't come in here being, excuse the word, but I'm going to use the word that they said, sissy. Don't do that. Don't do that. Not directly towards me, but that was just the sermons that they were using. So, and what I've learned about churches, they point out a certain sin. They point out a certain sin that they would like to use. For instance, you have the seafood sin, the mixed linen sins, all of that. But if you are very in depth with religion, you would know that, especially Baptists, especially the Baptists, that the homosexual sin is extremely enforced. And so over time, but I'm the type of person, I'm more of a person that I do for me, and whatever makes me happy. I've learned over the years, I didn't come to terms with this until I want to say the pandemic. So the pandemic actually did both good and bad for me, because I was able to come to terms with not stop trying to make others happy, or stop trying to suffocate yourself for others because you want them to be happy, or you want to, you're not this way for real. So be who you are, be authentic and true to who you are. And so when I came out to my mother and my father, it was extremely, the way that it was, the words, some of the phrasing, yes. Some of the phrases that she used was weird, with us being in the South, you can't be that way because, I'm very involved in my community. And she was trying to use that against me with it. Now, is she coming around now? Yeah. We've talked about it, and she's understanding that she can't change me, but I've really strayed away from going to church because of, that the judgment around the church. A lot of people will ask me, for instance, I went to, I want to say about 2 months ago, I went to a revival with my cousin. And one of the deacons asked me, he would say, hey, you got a girlfriend? That's the first thing. And I understand that there are certain people that practice, a religion. They believe in what they believe in because that's what they have been taught. That's what they have been studying. They say you study the Bible, so that's what they've been studying, and they don't know any better. They've been misled. They've been misled a lot, actually. So I just strayed away from church altogether. I just used my own. I do still pray. I do still worship God, but as in the church environment, I stray away from it because a lot of people are very judgmental in the church. Yeah, so it's real. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But the blessing I do have, a blessing that came out of this, I want to say a blessing. I've gave you the cons of it. I want to give the pros. My friends, super supportive. My sister, super supportive. Even though my mother did react that way in the beginning, I will say this: the love that I received before coming out to her did not change. So my mother was still supportive of things that I'm wanting to do, things that for instance, this webinar, I'm working on a project called Meet Me in the Middle. I worked on something with GPB. I worked on something here in the community service project in here in the community. I'm also working on a podcast, but everything that I'm trying to do, she has supported me in it. But if you are LGBT, I know we may have some on the call, and you've had parents react a certain way, you understand where I'm coming from. Her persona, how can I explain it? I'm trying to break it in a way where she still showed me the same love, but sometimes she uses different contexts. And I think that's another problem though. And this is a problem that I'm going to pinpoint because from my experience is specifically, I'm pinpointing it on the African-American community, because a lot of individuals that are in the African-American community, males especially, are treated as nobodies or are pushed to the side when they come out as LGBT because of the fact that how we are raised that God does not love you or God does not care for you if you are that way. And in the Bible it do says, I'm not mistaken, I haven't read it in a while, but I think it says something as if a man lay with another man shall be sent to the pits of hell, something like that. But I still believe that God loves all of his children. So yeah, but that's my experience with religious trauma. Religion can be extremely stressful on you. And there were times, oh my God, there were times I've just cried myself to sleep here in my room praying, God, God, I don't want to be like this, because again, raised in church, because around these people telling me, hey, this is not right. This is not how you should live your life. You're going to sin, die, and go to hell. Do not get over. Yeah, we all have things we need to work on. Correct. You're going to die. You're going to go to hell. This is going to happen. And that is, as a kid, my mother always said, she always knew I was young. When I was young, that I was going to be homosexual. And she's always had this conversation with me. But I remember when I was 10 years old, this was before I came out, but again, she said she always knew when I was 10 years old, she kept coming to me because I was caught playing with a Barbie doll. Caught playing with a Barbie doll. She came to me, she said, you can't be like this. And literally, guys, I would be in my room crying, tears out, praying, God, please save me. Please change me. God, I want to be whole. I don't want to be like this anymore. I don't want to do this, God. I don't want to. And I began to get girlfriends to cover it up. And that caused me to be depressed. It caused me to be extremely sad. It caused me to be in a space that was extremely unhealthy for me. And so that's why I say the pandemic was a chance for me to loosen and loosen and absolutely find myself. And when I found myself, that was the best thing that happened to me, because I'm happier. My personality is I've always been a vibrant person, regardless of what I have going on. I always try to stay vibrant and loving to all people. So, but I'm more happier inside. At one point, I was just on the outside happy. On the outside, I was portraying something to an audience per se. But now, truly, authentically, I am happy. I am well, because I let the religion go. I'm not saying I let God go, but the religion. And a lot of people get confused with that. I let Christianity go. I let being bound to a certain way of life. I let that go. And my relationship is solely focused on God. My relationship is solely focused on whoever God is, you know. So yeah, but for anyone that is LGBT and has been in the church like me, again, raised every Saturday, choir practice, Sunday we go, and let me tell you something. You had more than one service, church anniversary. At the church anniversary, my mother had me in church every Sunday, every week. Y'all may not know something about this, but there is a thing that they do when the church is taking the kids on a vacation. They do vacation Bible school. So for a full week, we're at church every night, reading the Bible, studying the Bible, doing church songs. And so I grew up in church, but I had to learn how to separate and be who I am. And it was extremely depressing times. I strayed away from my friends because, you know, I was just so sad. And people would ask me again, people at school would ask me, "Oh, Tobias, are you gay?" And I would be like, no, get so offensive, because again, I was trying to be someone. I was trying to portray something I wasn't. And that was because I was in the church. That was because I knew my parents were people that followed God fully. When I say, well, let me tell you, when I say fully, I mean they follow God how they want to. And that's a lot of times, that's what church people do. Follow God to their extent. They follow God to a way of, okay, I do this, but we're going to bypass this and we're going to focus on this little part right here. And that's how it was, very hypocritical. So yeah, I learned to just separate religion and have my personal relationship with God, and let that go. So yeah, that's my experience with religious trauma. And I do not wish that on anyone. Guys, I would be on this call all day explaining to you, you know, the journey of it, how it felt. Because, and a lot of times the church people use it as, well, hang around a lot of girls. I always hung around my cousin, my big cousin, my boy cousin. And I really feel like that's how the phrase "you were born like this" is true. Because I feel like, as long as I can remember, I've always, you know, been attracted to the same sex. But yeah, I'm turning over back to David. And I thank you all for listening to me. And I hope that you take something away from my story.
Thank you so much for sharing, Tobias. I so appreciate your experience, your willingness to share. Your passion and your energy are contagious, and so I so appreciate you. We're going to open it up for some question and answer time. As we do so, if you have any questions in particular, feel free to come on mic and ask those, or if you prefer to share those otherwise in chat, feel free to do so as well. And again, those questions can be to someone specific or just in general to all three of our speakers today. So I'll start us off. So I'm curious, one of the questions I have for you all is, we've talked a lot about the impact of religious trauma and the impact that it has on individuals, the way that it impacts their behavioral health, the way that it impacts their mental and emotional health, as well as their relationships. I'm curious, what are the kinds of practices that you would suggest to faith communities can do to try to prevent religious trauma? And so if I may, pastor, I'm a member of a congregation or a faith community, and I want to bring this to my faith leader, or I want to be able to have this conversation. What are the things that what are sort of those solid approaches that I can suggest to say, hey, as a community, we have to make sure that we are not causing religious trauma and that people are able to have positive experiences, and that this is a place that promotes health and that doesn't put the emotional health and well-being of individuals at risk. How do I do that? Or what are the steps that I can take to try to ensure that's clear in things like faith community structures and hierarchy and organizational structure, but also maybe things like policies and programming?
I can speak on that first, if it's okay. My son has a history of suicide ideation. My son has attempted suicide several times. So novice me, I shared that with the church one time when he was in the hospital. And one of the leaders said to me, oh, I'm not going to speak that into existence. You're speaking suicide into existence. He's not going to do that. He's just trying to get some attention from you. And I looked at that person, I turned around and I just walked away. And I just began to cry because I'm the one that cut the cord off his neck. So he wasn't trying to get attention. The door was locked and I knew something was wrong and went to him. It wasn't that he did this and stood in front of me and just put a cord around his neck and was like, hey, mom, look. So for me, I think that religious entities, if you're a leader, even if you're just attending, having knowledge of mental health, having knowledge of trauma, having knowledge of suicide and things of that nature, because that's real. Having knowledge of who is in your congregation so that you can say things appropriately, you can support appropriately, and not say things that are harmful and hurtful. Because I never went back to speak to that person again. That's a sin also. We're not supposed to ignore people. When you're in church, you're supposed to talk to everybody, love everybody. Now I can love you, but I don't have to talk to you. So keep your little foolishness on your side. And don't tell me how my son trying to get attention. My son is hurting, and that just hurt me so bad, because my son had also shared one time that he attempted suicide by cop. And I said, baby, why did you do that? He said, because I just don't want to hurt anymore. I don't want to be here. And I'd be better if I were dead. And I had to share it to him, but I wouldn't be. So there were so many times that he held on and didn't do things because he knew it would hurt me. And I was trying to use anything I can to keep him from hurting himself. So if religious leaders and even the congregation educated themselves on mental health and how to give support, not giving advice, not telling me, oh, that's just in your head, just to help and support. Even if you say you're going to pray about the situation, I'm not offended by that. But to tell me he's trying to get attention, that was hurtful. And that closed the door from any type of support I could receive from that person, because that was very invalidating for me as his mother and for him as a person. So just educating yourselves, just everyone within congregations educating yourselves. And if you can bring some of that education back to your leaders, even though it's hard to educate your leaders because, they think they got that direct line with God and they know what they're talking about. But if we could just educate ourselves and educate our leaders, we would know how to interact with others and support them appropriately and not make them feel isolated.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that. It's so important to educate our kind of spiritual and religious leaders when they can begin to prioritize the needs of individuals over the needs of their beliefs. When Adamina was talking about her experience with her son, and the religious leader says, well, I'm going to conceptualize that in a way that I can still maintain my beliefs, and your experience is less valid than my beliefs. I think whenever that's the case, that there's at least the possibility of harming others. You know, we start with a person-centered approach to these issues. We can, you know, what do you need? What is your experience that we can believe you, as opposed to I need to force you under my beliefs or into my concept. And I work with folks from lots of different religious backgrounds. And the more kind of fundamentalist the group is, the harder that is, because when your beliefs are so connected to your identity, when there's no separation between you, the person, and your beliefs, if you question the beliefs or say, hey, these aren't working for me, this way of believing isn't working for me, it feels threatening to them personally. And so I think it can be really challenging to have those kinds of conversations. I think just some things that can help facilitate that is to ask questions, to be curious. You know, well, what if my experience is valid? What if there's a different way of seeing this? What if there's, you know, and you're kind of modeling that curiosity, which can begin to undermine that kind of rigid black and white thinking. And so, yeah, I think there's some ways of doing that. It's not easy. In my experience, we don't change our minds when we're feeling threatened. And so if we can, you know, develop a context that feels safer and more okay, and I think openness and curiosity can be a way of helping facilitate that. The caveat I would put there is, you know, defending yourself first, prioritizing your safety. You will not hurt my child or myself. It's not okay to treat me this way. And once you're at a place of safety, then there can be some more openness and compassion and understanding. And I think modeling that can be a way of kind of you know, changing minds a little by little.
Yeah, to kind of reiterate what Adamina and Brian has said, I think the church has to start with the youth. And the reason why I say that is because when they grow up, now they're grown up, they're like, hey, there's no point of me going to church. And a lot of churches are, this is the big problem now. People are leaving church, and a lot of people don't understand why, no, people are not coming to church. You know, people be not paying, you know, the tithes for your church dues is church tithes, but people are leaving church because of the church is not helping, or church is not assisting others as they supposed to be. They're not really doing missionary work. Instead, it's more of a judgmental zone. It's more of a zone of condemning, a zone of push aside. That's, if I'm being honest. So yeah, I feel like churches should be more opening and accepting and loving to the youth. And that puts more out to the youth. That brings more of a positive vibe. Because I think, again, the youth is the next leader. They are the next leaders. So yeah.
Thank you all. In chat, I see Cassandra has asked the question, can anyone speak more on how to assist children and youth in the church and left the church? When we see this happen, the judgment or the hurtful words, phrases, and looks.
I think I can speak on that a little bit. Let me read the question. Let's see what she said. How can we assist? Can anyone speak more how to assist children and youth in the church? You know, it's kind of hard for a child to be assisted. And the reason why I say that, because a lot of times kids, like especially little ones, they're very curious about a lot of things. And in the church, again, there's really no room for curiosity. If we're being honest, there's really no room for curiosity. So for instance, I really had to assist myself. That's how when I had to assist myself. I'm a very strong person in personality. So I had to just be able to understand, hey, it's not what others think. It's not what others believe, it's what I believe. And so if we could get that in the youth's head, you know, it's what you believe, it's what you feel, whatever you feel is comfortable for you or best for you, that's what you need to go by, not with the other things. And a lot of time it is hard because, for instance, especially if your parent is that person that is condemning you, you're like, well, wow, you know, how can I do this? How can I make this work? So yeah, but you know, just whatever is comfortable for you, whatever is best for you, you feel, go for it. Don't let no one else break it for you.
I love that, Tobias, as you're saying, you know, sometimes we get into that problem solving or assisting or helping kind of mode. And I find that maybe creating a context of enough safety and support and trust and respect, and then, you know, kind of honoring consent, you know, those principles and practices can be so helpful. It's not a matter, I don't have an answer for you, you know, but I think that you have an answer for yourself. I'm going to support that and create a context of safety and support. And that can be, you know, personally empowering, as opposed to, you know, I'm going to help you figure this out or make this better for you. And yeah, so I really appreciate you pointing that out, because I think, you know, we like to solve problems as humans. Like our brains, you know, really gravitate towards like, how can we make this better? How can I solve this? And oftentimes, you know, folks don't want or need that. They just want to know that they're safe and accepted without judgment. And you can empower them to, you know, create a context where they can be themselves more fully. Yeah.
I think in my experience with my son, being as though that, you know, he does have autism, so he takes in information in a different way. He was curious. He never didn't want to be in church. He never did not want to go. He liked the fellowship of being in church. When we were at the larger church, he was like, Mom, it's too much. I have a headache, and you know, it's a lot going on. It's really loud, but I want to be there. You know, I bought him noise canceling headphones. I did all these things to help make him comfortable, but it was overwhelming, you know? So I had to choose, do I want to stay at this mega church that I love? Or do I really want to support my child so he can experience church in the way that's best for him? So I had to downgrade the size of the church and go to a smaller church, but I also had to invest in buying a Bible that he was able to comprehend, a Bible that was able to work for him. I was really blessed to be able to find, my son loves comic books, and I found the comic book Bible, and it has all the Bible stories in it that are in comic book form. So he was able to read that. And then I got him a youth study Bible. So when he would read the comic book version, that would make him curious to go into the other Bible and read the scriptures. I never put myself as his parent in a position to make or force him to do anything, because I wanted to be connected to him, and I wanted him to see me as a source of safety and support, because he was going through so much and he did feel very alone. So if I were to help alienate him more, then I would lose him. And that's not what my desire was. My desire was to support him in what he wanted, even if I had to sacrifice what I wanted as a parent, because my feelings aren't important. It's not important at that point, because if it's him or me, it's always going to be him. And I think when it comes to parenting, each of us can just do the best that we can do. And for me, the best that I can do is to make that sacrifice for him. And for me, if I go to church on Sundays and leave him at home with my mom, you know, because she does church on the computer also. But if I go to church on Sunday and leave him home with my mom, I don't feel like that I'm failing as a parent. I did at first. I felt like you're not pushing enough. But I was like, is it worth him having a meltdown at church? Or should you let him be comfortable and get a word that's going to be fulfilling and uplifting instead of condemning, as Tobias said? Because a lot of sermons in the Baptist church, they're accountability sermons. And you shouldn't do this, and don't do that, and don't feel this. And my son's a young man. When he started getting interested in girls and sexuality and viewing certain things, I brought that to the psychiatrist. I said, how are we supposed to talk about this? What is a safe way to have this conversation with my son so that he doesn't feel like he's evil, so that he doesn't feel like he's doing something wrong, so that he doesn't feel more shame about what's going on within his body? You know, the psychiatrist said to me, you are doing an amazing job because you're removing your beliefs to support your son. And I was just like, what? Like, don't all parents do this? And he's like, no, you're really supporting him. And I've just recently started seeing that I am doing a good job, because I had so much doubt before, because I was getting so much judgment from the religious community, from my family, from a lot of different people. But when I started to allow Elijah to guide the ship, that's my son's name, Elijah. You can see how much of the church that I've been into. Elijah's from the Bible, for those that don't know. But when I started to let him guide the ship and really go along for the ride and support the way I should, that made it easier and more comfortable to have conversations with him, to have an open conversation about suicide, to have an open conversation with my son about sex. And all mothers know that's not what we want to be talking about. But if that's what he needs, then that's what I need to do. So to honestly let your child be curious, as Tobias said, and support them in what they're trying to do or want to talk about, that helps keep them connected to the things that are true to them. And that really should be our focus. You want people to be connected and true to what is true to them, and make it a way for them, whatever you have to do to make that possible. Because maybe they don't want to go to church. Maybe that's not what they want to do. Maybe that's what you want them to do. And we really have to remove ourselves and think about that. That doesn't mean that they don't want God.
Thank you so much, y'all. This is, again, I think an important conversation, and I realize Brian and others could, I think all of our panelists could talk about this topic for days if we had the time, and really go into some of those details. I want to thank each of you, Tobias, Brian, Adamina. Thank you so much for your willingness to share your expertise, your stories, your experience, your wisdom. I so greatly appreciate each of you and your willingness to be on this today. As we close, I do want to send a couple quick reminders. Give me 1 second to share. So again, we do have a couple other webinars related to this coming up. Our next one is going to be on November 12th, in which we'll be talking about clergy burnout and compassion fatigue, and the impact of compassion fatigue and burnout on faith leaders, and the way that that impacts the ability to support the mental health of children and youth within those faith communities. So that again will be on November 12th, same time. We really look forward to being able to continue some of these conversations and to be able to continue this work. As we do, we want to continue to be able to bring these free resources to you, and we are excited to be able to hear from you in order to do that. And so we ask that you do please take a few moments to give us your feedback. A link to that feedback form will be included in a follow-up email that's immediately following today's session. And your completion of the survey is, again, a very important part of our quality control, and helps to ensure that our funding for the future for this project continues, as it allows us to continue to provide you with resources and training at no cost. And so if you could just please take a few moments to let us know your thoughts, it would be greatly appreciated. And again, if you are looking for more information, you want to know more about the work of NTAC, some of the things that we're doing, some of the different resources that are coming out, or if there's resources and things that you want to be able to see in your community that you would say, hey, I really want to learn more about such and such. There's a link here in this PowerPoint to request some additional technical assistance. TA, please check out our website, or connect with us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And thank you again so much for sharing your time. Just a final thank you to our speakers today. And I really look forward to us being able to continue some of these conversations here as this series continues. And so hope to see you on November 12th, and have a great day and good weekend.